The cardboard box weighed almost nothing. A coffee mug, a phone charger, one folder. That was everything Logan Carter had left after 11 years of building a career, and the laughter behind him made sure he knew it. Vanessa Brooks stood by the glass doors, arms crossed, smiling the way people smile when they think they've already won. Logan didn't turn around. He walked out through the front entrance of Harrison Global, set the box down on the concrete railing, and pulled out his phone. His voice, when he spoke, wasn't angry. It wasn't even loud. It was calm, almost gentle. Fire every one of them. 6 words. And in less than an hour, an entire floor of people who thought they'd just won would learn exactly who they'd been laughing at. Because the man they fired that morning, he wasn't just some employee. He was the reason the building was still standing. And by tonight, every single one of them would know it. This is the story of the quietest man in the room and the 6 words that ended everything. 3 weeks earlier, nobody on the 14th floor of Harrison Global knew Logan Carter's name. That was exactly how he wanted it. He'd been back in the United States for less than a month, carrying nothing but a leather messenger bag and a badge that said Operations Associate Temporary. No title, no corner office, no warning to anyone that the son of the company's founder was about to walk through the front doors of his own family's empire. As a nobody, his father, Harrison Carter, had built this company from a small regional logistics firm into one of the largest privately held conglomerates in the country. 4 decades of work, 4 decades of long nights and harder decisions. And now, at 71, Harrison was finally ready to hand it over. But he had one condition. Whoever takes this seat after me, Harrison had told his son, has to understand this company from the ground up, not from above. Logan hadn't argued. He'd spent years overseas doing the kind of quiet, unglamorous work most executives never touch: supply chains, restructuring, the parts of a business nobody writes press releases about. And he'd learned more down there, in the weeds, than he ever had in a boardroom. So when his father called and said it was time, Logan didn't ask for a corner office. He asked for a desk on floor 14. The HR coordinator, a quiet man named Greg, barely looked up when Logan introduced himself, handed him a badge, pointed toward the elevator, went back to his paperwork. Nobody looked twice. That was the point. Floor 14 wasn't glamorous. It was the connective tissue of the company: project coordinators, data analysts, compliance officers, the people who made sure everything else actually worked. If something was wrong inside Harrison Global, Logan believed it would show up here first. He was right. He just didn't know how wrong it would turn out to be. His new supervisor was a woman named Vanessa Brooks, mid-40s, sharp, and comfortable in a way that only comes from holding power long enough to stop questioning how you use it. On his first morning, she looked him over once, told him he'd be handling data consolidation for the quarterly compliance report, and dropped a stack of documents on his desk that were already 3 days overdue. She walked away before he could even respond. Logan sat down, opened the files, and got to work. The data was a mess. Inconsistent formatting, missing information, the same entries duplicated across 5 different departments. Nothing complicated, just slow, tedious, the kind of work most people try to avoid. Logan didn't avoid it. By the end of his very first week, he'd quietly finished 3 assignments that had originally been split between 4 people. He didn't announce it. He didn't ask for credit. He just uploaded the finished reports to the shared drive and moved on. 2 days later, he overheard something that told him everything he needed to know about floor 14. Derek Walsh, loud, confident, the kind of man who said things that sounded like jokes but weren't, was telling Vanessa that the vendor report had been praised by the compliance director. The report Logan had spent 12 hours rebuilding from scratch. Derek didn't hesitate, didn't flinch. He just took the credit like it belonged to him. Vanessa nodded, impressed, and she copied Derek, not Logan, on the email to senior leadership. Logan's name didn't appear anywhere in that message. He read it once, closed his laptop, and went to get a cup of coffee. He wasn't angry. He was paying attention. Because what Logan didn't know yet, what none of them knew, was that every quiet moment like this one was being filed away, watched, remembered. Somewhere on that floor, a system had been running for years, a system where good work disappeared into the wrong hands, and mistakes always seemed to land on the person with the least power to push back. Logan was about to become that person, and he was about to let them think they'd won. By the start of his second week, Logan understood something most people on floor 14 had stopped noticing a long time ago. This wasn't ordinary office politics. This was a system. There was an inner circle, Vanessa at the center, flanked by Derek and a quieter woman named Paula Simmons. And then there was everyone else. The line between the two groups wasn't subtle. It was practically drawn on the floor. Derek was loud, careless with his opinions, always saying things that sounded like jokes, but landed like warnings. Paula was different, quiet, precise. The kind of person who watched everything and said only what kept her aligned with whoever held the power in the room. Together, the three of them ran floor 14 like a machine, and Logan had just figured out what the machine was built to do. Any project that turned out well got claimed, usually by Derek, sometimes by Paula, occasionally by Vanessa herself. Any project that went wrong, a late report, a miscommunication, a missed deadline, found its way to whoever had the least power to argue back. For now, that was Logan, and he let it stay that way. But it was watching what happened to Ruth that made the pattern impossible to ignore. Ruth was a compliance analyst. 6 years at the company. Careful and thorough in a job that left no room for carelessness. One afternoon, she made a small formatting error in a regulatory submission, the kind of mistake that took 90 seconds to fix. Vanessa didn't fix it quietly. She stood in the middle of the open floor, loud enough that everyone within 30 feet stopped typing, and said, "Ruth, this is the kind of mistake that makes the whole department look careless. Fix it. Now." Ruth didn't argue. She didn't even flinch, not visibly. "Anyway, yes," she said. "I'll have it corrected in 5 minutes." Vanessa walked away like nothing had happened. Ruth sat very still for a long moment, staring at her screen, her face carefully arranged into something that gave nothing away. Logan watched all of it from 3 desks over. What struck him wasn't the mistake, or even the way Vanessa had handled it. It was Ruth's stillness afterward, the specific, practiced stillness of someone who had learned, probably a long time ago, that any visible reaction would be used against her later. That kind of stillness isn't natural. It's trained. And Logan understood, watching her, that Ruth had been trained by this exact floor, this exact system, probably for years. The cruelty wasn't always loud like that, either. Sometimes it was quieter, almost invisible if you weren't looking for it. Lunch plans made just loudly enough for Logan to hear, then finalized in a way that made it clear he wasn't invited. Questions in meetings that weren't designed to get answers, but to expose gaps asked publicly. So any stumble became evidence in a case nobody had officially opened. Requests that landed on his desk at 10 minutes to 5. Due the next morning, with just enough missing information to guarantee something would go wrong. None of it was big enough to complain about on its own. That was the sophistication of it. Every single incident could be explained away individually. Together, they formed something else entirely, something deliberate, something with a shape. Logan started running 5 miles every morning before sunrise, not just for his body, for his mind. In the quiet, before the office filled up with noise, He processed everything he'd seen the day before, turned it over, looked at it from every angle, filed it away. He had expected ordinary office friction when he took this assignment. Politics, inefficiency, the occasional clash of personalities. What he found instead was something closer to an ecosystem, a managed, self-sustaining structure with a hierarchy, and an unspoken agreement among its participants about exactly what was allowed and exactly who was protected. And everyone below that line had only two options: participate, or stay silent, because on floor 14, silence was the only version of safety anyone had left. Logan thought about his father then, not as the chairman's son, but as someone who'd spent his whole life studying what made organizations work, and what quietly, slowly made them fail. A company could look perfect from the outside. Strong numbers, good name, respected brand, and still be rotting from the inside. Floor by floor, one silenced person at a time. His father had always said the real value of a company wasn't on the balance sheet. It was in whether the people inside it actually trusted each other. Logan had believed that his whole life. He was only now understanding what it looked like when it wasn't true. And he was about to be handed the one assignment that would prove it. In his third week, Vanessa handed Logan something bigger than anything she'd given him before. She assigned him to lead the documentation for a sensitive internal data audit. For a moment, Logan almost wondered if he'd misjudged her. Maybe this was trust. Maybe the floor wasn't as broken as it looked. He took the assignment seriously, built the entire tracking system from scratch, coordinated with 3 separate departments, had the framework finished 2 full days ahead of schedule, clean, organized, ready for review. And because it was the responsible thing to do, he shared access with Vanessa and Derek, so the rest of the team could keep building on it while he finished the final sections. It was a reasonable decision. It was also, he'd realize later, exactly the mistake they'd been waiting for him to make. On a Thursday morning, Logan walked onto the floor and noticed the blinds in Vanessa's office were drawn. That never happened. Through the gap at the edge of the glass, he could see Derek and Paula already seated inside, along with a woman he didn't recognize. He'd barely set his bag down when the woman stepped out and asked him to come in. Her name was Sandra Pruitt, HR Director. Her expression was calm in the specific way people are calm when they're delivering news they didn't write themselves. "Logan," she said, closing the door behind him. "We need to talk about the audit system." Vanessa stood off to the side, arms folded. Derek sat in the corner, unusually still, the stillness of someone who already knew exactly how this scene was going to end. Sandra opened a folder. Over the last 2 days, a significant amount of restricted client data was accessed and extracted from the audit system. The activity traces back to the login credentials you used to build the tracking framework. Logan didn't move. "You're saying I did this?" "I'm saying there's a clear audit trail," Sandra said. "And, given the evidence, the company can't continue your employment." "Can I see the trail?" Sandra glanced at Vanessa. Vanessa answered instead, "That documentation is with legal right now. It's not available to you." "Is there a process to contest this, given the nature of the incident?" Sandra said quietly. "The termination is immediate and final." She slid a single page across the desk. Logan looked at it for a long moment. Then he picked up the pen and signed it. "Can I get a copy?" Sandra handed him one without hesitation. "Thank you," Logan said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look at Vanessa. He didn't look at Derek. He stood up, walked back to his desk, and packed the only things that had ever really been his: a coffee mug, a phone charger, one folder into a small cardboard box that Sandra had already left waiting beside his chair. The floor had gone very quiet. Nobody was working anymore. Everyone was watching without appearing to watch. The way people do when they know something is happening, but don't understand what. Logan carried the box to the elevator, wrote it down in silence, walked out through the front lobby, into the afternoon light. Exactly the way we saw him do at the very beginning of this story. He set the box down on the concrete railing, and this is the part where most people, if they were in his position, would have felt panic, or humiliation, or the specific, burning anger of being punished for something they didn't do. Logan didn't feel any of that, because Logan hadn't been surprised in 3 weeks, not once. He'd watched this exact machine take apart other people quietly, deliberately, one manufactured mistake at a time. He'd simply never expected to be its next target quite this soon. What he felt, standing on those front steps with his entire desk fitting inside a box the size of a briefcase, wasn't anger. It was clarity. The kind of clarity that only shows up when a problem you've been studying for weeks finally reveals its whole shape, and you understand exactly, precisely, what it's going to take to fix it. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, scrolled to a contact saved under a single letter, and pressed call. The line connected on the second ring. Martin Cole. The general counsel picked up before the second ring, which told Logan everything he needed to know. His father was already aware. Word moved fast when it needed to. Martin. It's Logan. His voice was level, unhurried, almost casual. If you didn't know what was underneath it. I need 3 things. And I need them fast. Go ahead. No hesitation. No questions yet. Just readiness. First, legal hold on every digital record from floor 14. Emails. Access logs. Performance reviews. Everything. Going back 4 years. There was a brief pause on the other end, the sound of someone already typing before Logan had even finished the sentence. Done. What else? Convene the board. Within the hour. They'll be there, Martin said. And the third, Logan looked out through the glass at the street below ordinary people, walking past an ordinary building. Coffee in hand. Phones out. No idea what was about to happen inside the walls a few feet away from them. Complete blackout on my identity. He said, nobody finds out who I am until I give the signal. Not security. Not the board assistants. No one. Understood. A short pause. And then, in a voice that had lost just a little of its professional calm, are you all right? I'm fine, Logan said. And strangely, he meant it. The call lasted 4 minutes and 30 seconds. He sat in his car afterward, in the concrete quiet of the parking structure. Engine off. The cardboard box resting on the passenger seat beside him like evidence of a crime nobody else could see yet. People would ask him about this moment later, how he could sound so calm, so unshaken. Less than an hour after being escorted out of a job he'd never even wanted the credit for. But anger requires surprise. And Logan hadn't been surprised by a single thing that happened on that floor in 3 weeks. Not the stolen reports. Not the public humiliation. Not even this. What he felt, sitting alone in that parking structure, was something closer to stillness. The particular stillness of a man who has been quietly building a case in his own mind for weeks and has just watched the final piece fall into place exactly where he expected it to. He drove home, changed his shirt-plain trousers. Simple button-down. Nothing that would signal what was coming. Was back in the building 40 minutes later. This time, he didn't walk through the front lobby. He took the private elevator from the executive parking level, the one his father had given him the access code for on his very first day back in the country. The one he'd never once used. Not even to avoid a crowded lobby, and rode it straight up to the 32nd floor, where the boardroom and the executive offices looked out over the entire western skyline of the city. The view up here was nothing like floor 14. Logan had always believed that was part of the problem with how most companies were built. The people at the top spent so much time looking outward, at the skyline, at the numbers, at the future that they forgot to look down at what was actually happening inside their own walls. His father, Harrison Carter, was already in the boardroom standing, not seated, because Harrison Carter never sat down when he was angry. Dark suit, no tie, white hair cut close, even well past 70. He still carried the straight-backed posture of a man who'd once worn a uniform and never fully let it go. He looked at his son as Logan walked in, and something shifted in his face. Not quite relief. Something close to it. Martin was already there with 2 members of the legal team. Laptops open. 2 board members appeared on the screen at the far end of the table, waiting, and Sandra Pruitt, the woman who had handed Logan his termination notice only hours earlier, sat quietly near the end of the table, her composure noticeably thinner than it had been that morning. Harrison didn't open with pleasantries. "Legal hold is confirmed," he said. "IT security is already running a parallel audit on the access logs. Nobody on floor 14 knows anything has changed. As far as they're concerned, they won." He turned to his son. "Tell them what you told me." Logan stood at the head of the table and walked them through 3 weeks without notes, without hesitation, without a single wasted word. The stolen credit, the manufactured mistakes. Ruth, humiliated in front of the entire floor over a 90-second error. The vendor report Derek had claimed as his own, without a flicker of guilt. And now, a fabricated data breach, used to remove him within hours, without so much as showing him the evidence against him. Sandra listened without expression. But Logan noticed her hand tighten slightly around the folder in front of her, the same folder she'd been handed that morning and told to deliver, without ever being allowed to look inside it herself. Martin's team had already begun pulling the access logs. It didn't take long to find what they were looking for. "Here," one of the analysts said, turning a laptop toward the table. The extraction was flagged under Logan's login, but the device that accessed the system doesn't match anything he's ever used. "Whose is it?" Harrison asked, though something in his voice suggested he already suspected the answer. The analyst checked the registration. Derek Walsh's terminal. Silence settled over the room, the specific silence of people, realizing how simple the whole scheme had actually been. It wasn't sophisticated. It wasn't even particularly clever. It had simply never needed to be, because no one on that floor had ever been seriously examined before. Nobody had ever looked closely enough to catch it. Harrison looked at his son. "How do you want to proceed exactly as planned?" Logan said, "All hands. This afternoon. I don't want my name attached to anything until the evidence is already on the table in front of everyone." His father nodded once. Slowly. "Sandra," he said, "send the notice. Company-wide. Mandatory attendance." Sandra's pen was already moving. Outside the boardroom windows, the city carried on exactly as it had an hour earlier, unaware that somewhere inside this building, an entire floor's worth of quiet cruelty was about to become very, very loud. By 3:50 that afternoon, the atrium on the ground floor of Harrison Global was full. High ceilings, a raised platform at the north end, enough space to hold the entire company standing shoulder to shoulder, and every single one of them had shown up. Because the notice had only said one thing. The founding chairman has an announcement regarding the company's future leadership. Nothing more. And in a building like this one, nothing more was needed to make an entire company stop working and start speculating. Logan stood in a side corridor off the platform, watching the crowd through a narrow gap in the partition. He could see Vanessa near the center of the room, standing with the easy, settled confidence of someone expecting good news. Derek stood beside her, arms crossed, smirking at something. Paula was a few feet back, watching the stage with the careful attention of someone who liked to know things before anyone else did. None of them had connected this meeting to the termination they'd carried out that morning. None of them had noticed that Sandra Pruitt hadn't come back to the floor. "Ready?" Martin asked quietly. Beside him, Logan didn't answer right away. He was looking at Vanessa, at the version of her that still believed, in this exact moment, that she had won. "Ready," he said. At 4 o'clock exactly, Harrison Carter walked onto the platform. He didn't rush. He never rushed. 40 years of building this company had given him the kind of unhurried authority that made an entire room go quiet before he'd said a single word. For the first sentence, he spoke without a microphone, and the room settled so completely that his voice carried anyway. Then someone adjusted the sound system, and his words filled every corner of the atrium. "Thank you," he began, "for the work you've all put into this company. Building Harrison Global has been the defining project of my life, and handing it to the right person is the most important decision I have left to make." He paused, letting that land. "I've spent a long time thinking about what kind of leader this company actually needs. Not someone who simply understands the financials or the strategy from 32 floors up. Someone who understands what it actually feels like to work here at every level, under every condition, including the hardest ones." Another pause, longer this time. "The next chairman of Harrison Global has been inside this building for the past 3 weeks. The room went very still. I'd like him to come forward." Logan stepped out from the corridor and walked onto the platform. He was still wearing the same clothes he'd been fired in that morning. Plain trousers, simple button-down, clean but unremarkable shoes. He carried nothing in his hands. He stood beside his father and looked out at the atrium, and the silence that followed was total. It was the specific silence of several hundred people trying, in real time, to process something that fit no category they'd prepared for. From the platform, Logan watched Vanessa's face move through it in stages. Recognition first, a flicker, then confusion, then calculation. Fast and visible, as she tried to remember every single thing she'd ever said about him. Done to him, done in front of him, and then something else. Something that didn't have a clean name. Logan felt nothing reactive, watching it happen. He hadn't come up here to enjoy this. He'd come up here to begin the work. "My name is Logan Carter," he said, once the room let him speak. "Some of you have worked with me for the past 3 weeks without knowing who I was. That was intentional. I asked my father to let me start as an ordinary employee, because I wanted to understand this company the way you understand it, not the way it looks from the top." He let that settle before continuing. "It was the most instructive 3 weeks of my career, and some of what I learned requires immediate attention." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I'll let our general counsel explain." He stepped aside. Martin Cole took the platform, precise and unhurried, in the way people are when they're presenting findings they're completely certain of. In connection with a personnel matter that occurred earlier today, Martin said, "The legal department initiated a review of records from the floor 14 operations team. That review uncovered evidence of a fabricated data breach used to terminate an employee without cause." A ripple moved through the crowd, not loud, just a shift, a collective intake of breath. Further examination is already revealing a broader pattern of conduct that this company takes very seriously. Martin continued, "That review will be complete within 24 hours. In the meantime, all relevant personnel have been placed on administrative suspension, effective immediately." He named no one from the platform. "The notifications," he said, "would be delivered directly." The atrium didn't erupt. It went stiller, the particular stillness of a room, realizing that something significant enough had just been said that nobody wanted to be the first to react out loud. Logan stood there and looked out at the crowd, and found himself thinking not about Vanessa, not about Derek, not even about the satisfaction he was supposed to be feeling right now. He was thinking about Ruth, about her sitting at her desk after being corrected in front of everyone, holding her face perfectly still, because she'd learned, somewhere along the way, that any visible reaction would be used against her later. He was thinking about how many people on that floor had been living that exact same moment, quietly, for years, and how not one of them had ever felt safe enough to say so out loud. That hadn't been an accident. It had been the entire design, and as the crowd began to break apart, whispering, reaching for their phones, Logan understood that the hardest part of this day wasn't over. It was about to begin. Logan was at his desk on the 32nd floor before 6 the next morning. The city outside was still gray, the early light too thin yet to draw a clear line along the skyline. He hadn't slept much. He'd spent most of the night at this same desk, going through preliminary files one at a time. Long after the rest of the building had gone dark, Martin arrived at 6:10 with the completed audit, a bound folder, and a second copy on a secure drive. Just in case. He set both down without ceremony and took the chair across from Logan. "It's worse than what we saw yesterday," Martin said. "Show me." They worked through it together for the next 2 hours, not as executive and lawyer, but as two people trying to understand exactly how much damage had been done, and to whom. The audit covered 4 years, the same 4 years now, under legal hold. In that time, the team under Vanessa Brooks had suppressed the advancement of at least 11 employees through manipulated performance scores. 3 of them had tried to do something about it, filing informal complaints through internal channels. All 3 complaints had quietly found their way back to Vanessa's desk, where they'd been marked resolved without any real investigation ever taking place. One employee had left the company within weeks of raising a concern, after a sudden, poorly substantiated negative review appeared in her file. Another had been quietly moved to a different floor after what the records only described as a personnel discussion. A third had accepted a confidential settlement and simply disappeared from the company's story altogether. Logan read each of their names slowly. He didn't want them to become numbers. Sandra's name is in 2 of these 3 files, Martin said carefully. As the HR contact, Logan nodded once and said nothing else about it yet. That conversation would come later, its own conversation. Not a footnote to this one. Beyond the individual cases, the pattern was even clearer. Derek's name appeared, again and again, on reports and summaries that bore almost no relationship to what he'd actually contributed. Paula had quietly managed the paperwork that made all of it nearly impossible to trace not the architect of the scheme, but the machinery that kept it running smoothly underneath everyone's notice. And Vanessa sat above all of it, approving, signing off, occasionally directing, more often simply allowing. Logan closed the folder and looked out at the window for a long moment. "What's our exposure if we don't act on this?" he asked. "Significant," Martin said, "and growing. If it ever came out that we had evidence of systemic misconduct and chose to manage it quietly, that settlement could be reopened. The 2 who left after complaining could be in the same position." "That's not the direction I'm considering," Logan said. "I didn't think it was." The real question Logan had been turning over wasn't whether to act. That had never been in doubt. It was scope. Vanessa, Derek, Paula. The evidence was specific, documented, undeniable. But the audit had also flagged 4 other people on that floor, each involved to different degrees. Some had actively participated. Others had simply gone quiet and let it happen, protecting the system instead of disrupting it. Logan had read every one of their files the night before, long after midnight, spread out across this same desk. 2 of the 4 had once been targets themselves. Years earlier, before they'd apparently decided it was easier to align with the machine than to keep resisting it. That didn't excuse what they'd done, but it complicated what accountability was supposed to look like, in a place that had made integrity so expensive to hold on to. By early afternoon, the decision was made. Vanessa, Derek, Paula, and the 4 others all terminated, each with documentation specifying exactly what conduct had led to it, not a vague separation notice. The truth, in writing, Sandra would remain. For now. Under a formal review, it was the harder line to draw, but acting on incomplete evidence, in either direction, would set the wrong precedent for how decisions would be made from now on. And Logan understood that today wasn't just about punishing 7 people. It was about deciding what kind of company this was going to be from this point forward. That afternoon, Vanessa called the legal line and asked to speak with him directly. Put her through. Logan said. She didn't open with an apology. She opened with context, the pressure she'd been under, the expectations passed down from above her. To the environment, she said she'd simply inherited when she took the role. Logan let her finish without interrupting. I read the full file, he said. Once she was done, including the parts that go back before the last few weeks, what it shows isn't pressure, Vanessa. It's a choice, sustained for 4 years, and it cost real people their careers in some cases, their livelihoods. I gave this company 8 years. She said. I know, Logan said, and the severance terms match your contract exactly. Legal will send them today. There was a long pause on the line. Thank you for the call, Logan said, and ended it. Derek never called at all. Paula sent a letter through an attorney, arguing her role had been administrative, not directive. Martin's team responded the same day, with the relevant pages of the audit attached, and nothing further to add. By the end of that first week, the independent review had already begun, and 2 employees who'd been quietly passed over years ago, for reasons that suddenly made a great deal more sense, were being called back in for a very different conversation. By 9 that morning, Logan rode the elevator down to floor 14 for the first time since the day he'd been fired from it. He hadn't announced the visit. He simply stepped off and stood for a moment in the open space near the entrance, taking in the same rows of desks, the same glass-walled office, the same window bank where Vanessa used to stand and talk about opportunity, like it belonged only to her. Her desk was empty now. So was Derek's. So was Paula's. The rest of the floor was barely working. People had shown up, opened their laptops, and then simply waited. Nobody quite knew what came next. Nobody had ever seen a floor like this get rebuilt before. Logan walked to the center of the room. Could everyone gather for a minute? It took less than 60 seconds. The remaining team pulled into a loose half-circle, some standing, some dragging chairs over, all of them watching him with the same careful, guarded attention. People learn when they've spent years figuring out that expressions aren't free. Logan didn't stand behind a desk. He didn't need a podium. I want to be direct with you, he said, about what's happened and what happens next. He told them the audit was finished, that the termination decisions were made, and they were final. I'm not here to explain myself or to ask for your approval, he said. I'm here because the people in this room worked inside something for years. Some of you were hurt by it, and I think you deserve to hear that from me directly, not from a memo. He told them the entire evaluation system on that floor was being suspended, effective immediately. Every performance record from the last 4 years would be independently reviewed before it was ever used for anything again. And starting this week, he said, there's a new reporting channel. It doesn't go through a manager. It goes straight to legal. And to me, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Ruth raised her hand. Will the review change decisions that were already made? She asked. Her voice careful, controlled. Promotions people didn't get. Roles people were passed over for. Yes, Logan said simply. Anywhere the record shows an evaluation was influenced by what we found, we're correcting it. Ruth nodded slowly and lowered her hand. Nothing dramatic crossed her face, just a small release, something that had been held tightly in place for a long time. Finally allowed to loosen, Logan noticed it. He didn't say anything about it. but he noticed a project coordinator near the back, 3 years on the floor. Rarely spoke up, raised his hand next. What about people who stayed quiet? Are they going to be penalized too? It was a fair question, and Logan answered it directly. The review is focused on people who actively participated, he said, not people who stayed silent. I understand that silence here was never really a neutral choice. It was survival. He paused. What I care about is making sure nobody on this floor ever has to make that calculation again. The coordinator nodded and lowered his hand. A few people around him exhaled quietly. But visibly, Logan spent the rest of the morning moving through the building, floor by floor. Unannounced, he'd ask people to gather and have some version of the same conversation each time. What happened? What was being done about it? What they could expect from him going forward? Some floors were more guarded than others. A few people asked hard questions. Most just listened, and a handful looked at him with the specific, earned skepticism of people who'd heard promises from leadership before, and weren't ready to believe this one yet either. Logan didn't ask them to trust him. He just told them what he was doing, and let the rest be earned over time. By the end of that first week, 2 employees who had been quietly passed over years earlier, for reasons that suddenly made a great deal more sense, were called back in. Neither was given the full story, only that the company had reevaluated an old decision and wanted to discuss a different path forward. Both agreed to meet. Both said yes. That Friday afternoon, Harrison came to the office with no scheduled purpose. He simply wanted to be present. He and his son walked the building together for nearly an hour, floor by floor. Harrison asking questions and mostly just listening to the answers. Near the end of the walk, they stood together by the window on the 32nd floor, looking out over the city in the fading afternoon light. I built this over 4 decades, Harrison said quietly, and these last few years, I was afraid it had started coming apart in ways I couldn't see anymore from up here. I understand that now, Logan said. I don't doubt you'll handle it right. I'm not sure I will, Logan admitted, but I intend to stay close to the floor. Keep looking at what's actually happening, not just what the reports say is happening. Harrison nodded slowly. That, he said, was always the right instinct. I just stopped trusting it in myself. Somewhere along the way, once the company got big enough that looking down stopped being comfortable, below them, the city kept moving, unaware that somewhere above it, a company was quietly deciding what kind of place it was going to become. The cardboard box had been sitting in the back seat of Logan's car for 2 weeks. He hadn't thought to bring it upstairs, not until one evening. After the building had emptied and the only light left on the 32nd floor was the one above his own desk, he carried it up, set it down, opened it. The coffee mug went on the windowsill. The charger, plugged into the wall. The folder, filed away in the cabinet beside his desk. Small things, nothing valuable, really, except that they were the things he'd carried out of a place that once tried to convince him he didn't belong there. And now they belonged exactly where they were. Because here's what Logan understood. Standing in that quiet office long after everyone else had gone home, a leader isn't remembered for the moment they finally showed their power. They're remembered for what they did with it, who they protected, who they made whole, what kind of place they left behind for the people who'd still be there long after every name on those termination notices had been forgotten. The work had only just begun. But it had begun honestly, and that was the only foundation strong enough to build anything real on top of. If this story moved you, hit subscribe, because the next one might just be the one that changes how you see everything.